For 50 years, the United States has controlled the global economy through something most people don't even know exists, the petrodollar. It's the most elegant economic weapon ever created, and it is dying right now in 2026. What's shocking isn't that it's dying. Economists have predicted that for decades. What's shocking is how fast it's collapsing and what's replacing it. BRICS nations aren't just building an alternative to the petrodollar system. They've already built it. They're already using it. And in the next 24 months, the entire global financial structure could shift away from American currency dominance forever. This isn't geopolitical speculation. This is mathematics and observable economic reality. Let me explain how the petrodollar worked, why it's failing now, and how BRICS saw this coming years before most economists even acknowledge the problem exists. Start with the mechanism that nobody talks about in school, but everyone should understand. After World War II, the United States emerged as the world's dominant military and economic power. The rest of the world was destroyed. Europe was rubble. Asia was devastated. The US had 50% of global GDP and owned most of the world's gold. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the world's governments made a deal. The US dollar would become the global reserve currency, backed by American gold reserves. Every country would peg their currency to the dollar. Every international transaction would use the dollar. This gave America extraordinary power. Countries needed dollars to trade internationally. To get dollars, they had to buy American goods or borrow from American banks. America's currency became the world's money. The system worked for 25 years until 1971, when it broke. President Nixon ended the gold standard because America's gold reserves couldn't cover all the dollars circulating globally. The system collapsed. The world should have moved to a new reserve currency. Instead, something more brilliant happened. The petrodollar system emerged. In the 1970s, OPEC nations controlled the world's oil supply. Oil was essential to every economy. Saudi Arabia especially had leverage over the entire global economy. But Saudi Arabia faced a problem. It was selling oil for dollars. But dollars were no longer backed by gold. Why should Saudi Arabia accept increasingly worthless American currency? For their most valuable resource? What happened next was genius from an American strategic perspective. The US made a deal with Saudi Arabia. America would guarantee Saudi Arabia's military security and political stability. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would only sell oil in US dollars, no other currency accepted. Oil became denominated exclusively in dollars. Suddenly, every nation on Earth needed dollars again, not to trade with America, but to buy energy. Oil powers every economy. You need oil, therefore you need dollars. Therefore you need to earn dollars through trade or borrow from American banks at American interest rates. America had rebuilt the dollar's dominance without gold. Instead, it was backed by the global necessity of energy. This system created two extraordinary benefits for America. First, global demand for dollars stayed high because countries needed them to buy oil. Second, America could print as many dollars as it wanted because the world had to accept them for energy purchases. Essentially, America had a permission slip to run massive budget deficits while other countries had to balance their books. This petrodollar system created American dominance for 50 years. But here's what nobody predicted. This system would create the conditions for its own destruction. As America printed more and more dollars to finance wars and social programs, the dollar weakened. America's trade deficit grew enormous. More dollars flowed out of America than valuable goods flowed in. Other countries accumulated massive dollar reserves they couldn't spend. China held $1.3 trillion in dollar reserves. Japan held $1.1 trillion. Saudi Arabia held hundreds of billions. These countries were essentially trapped holding depreciating currency they didn't want. Meanwhile, America's military was stretched thin across 800 military bases worldwide, many protecting the very countries that supplied the oil backing the dollar. The system was becoming increasingly absurd. America was protecting Saudi Arabia, so Saudi Arabia would sell oil in dollars, so America could maintain its currency dominance. But what if Saudi Arabia didn't need America's military protection anymore? What if there was an alternative system? This is where BRICS saw the opportunity years before anyone acknowledged it. In 2010, BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, represented 27% of global GDP, but had almost zero influence in global financial institutions. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both designed in 1944 to serve American interests, controlled global capital flows. When BRICS nations needed capital, they had to borrow from these institutions at American interest rates. When they wanted to trade with each other, they had to use dollars as the intermediate currency. It was economically inefficient and politically intolerable. In 2014, BRICS created a development bank, an alternative to the World Bank. In 2015, BRICS nations began settling trade with each other in their own currencies instead of dollars. These were small steps that nobody noticed, but they were the beginning of a parallel financial system. The genius move came in 2023 when BRICS expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia. This was the checkmate move. BRICS now controlled approximately 37% of global GDP and, critically, controlled approximately 42% of the world's proven oil reserves. You can't run a global financial system on the petrodollar if OPEC oil is no longer denominated in dollars. BRICS countries began discussing an alternative reserve currency backed by a basket of commodities: oil, gold, rare earth elements, and other resources. Suddenly, there was a competitor to the petrodollar that was backed by something real: energy and resources. What happened next shocked traditional economists who didn't see it coming. In 2024, BRICS nations increased trade settled in their own currencies from 24% to 47%. India and Brazil now settle most bilateral trade in rupees and reais, not dollars. Russia, cut off from dollar systems by sanctions, built alternative payment infrastructure that other nations could use. China's yuan became increasingly available as a trading currency because China guaranteed it could be exchanged for goods. By 2025, approximately $180 billion in daily trade was settled outside dollar systems, up from $30 billion in 2020. It's growing 30% year over year. This is the death of the petrodollar, not through collapse, but through irrelevance. Countries are realizing they don't need dollars to trade. They need dollars less and less every month. The system that trapped the world in American currency dependency is becoming optional. Here's what's shocking. The Federal Reserve didn't stop this. Congress didn't prevent it. America's military couldn't fight it because it's not a military threat. It's an economic alternative that's simply better for non-American nations. Countries aren't choosing BRICS because they hate America. They're choosing it because it costs them less. When you settle trade in dollars, you deal with dollar volatility, American interest rate decisions, and the threat of American sanctions. When you settle trade in a commodity-backed BRICS system, you deal with stability backed by resources. Mathematically, the choice is obvious. By 2026, the tipping point is visible. When more than 50% of global trade is settled outside the petrodollar, the system officially fails because it loses its primary mechanism of control. We're approaching 45-48% right now. The final 5-7% will shift in 2026-2027. This isn't prediction. This is observable financial reality happening in real time. What does commodity-backed currency mean in practice? For 50 years, America could print dollars infinitely because the world had to accept them for oil. A commodity-backed BRICS currency is different. You can only print as much currency as you have backing resources. This creates discipline. It prevents runaway inflation. It prevents the endless money printing that created America's current inflation crisis. For emerging market nations tired of losing purchasing power to American inflation, this is liberation. They can build wealth without watching it eroded by American monetary policy decisions made without their input. China understood this decades ago. That's why China accumulated gold, 6,000 tons, more than almost any nation. That's why China holds massive oil reserves. When a commodity-backed currency system launches, China's resources make the yuan more valuable. India is doing the same with gold accumulation. Russia, sanctioned, has been forced to build commodity reserves. By the time the BRICS currency formally launches, most experts predict 2026-2027, the major players have positioned themselves with the backing resources necessary to make it credible. The dollar will survive this transition. America won't collapse, but the dollar's role changes fundamentally. Instead of being the global reserve currency that every nation must use, it becomes one currency among several. The euro exists alongside the dollar. The renminbi will exist alongside the dollar. Eventually, a BRICS commodity currency will exist alongside the dollar. America will have to manage its currency like a normal nation instead of as the world's default money. This means American interest rates can't stay artificially low, because the world isn't forced to accept dollars. It means America's budget deficits matter more because they can't just print money the world is forced to accept. It means American geopolitical leverage declines because nations have alternatives. For ordinary Americans, this might mean higher import prices, different international investment returns, and less automatic global acceptance of American currency. But it also means America stops paying for global dominance through inflation exported worldwide. What's really stunning is the speed this is happening. In 2000, the dollar accounted for 71% of global reserves. Today, it's 59%. That's a 12 percentage point drop in 25 years, but the rate of decline is accelerating. The last 5 percentage point drop happened in just 3 years. At this rate, the dollar reaches 45-50% of reserves by 2030. That threshold is where the petrodollar system officially ends because it's no longer the dominant currency. The next 24 months are critical. If BRICS formally launches a commodity-backed currency in late 2026, and if that currency gains traction, trades at stable value, is accepted for oil purchases, provides better arbitrage opportunities than petrodollar, then the transition accelerates dramatically. By 2030, the petrodollar doesn't exist as the system. By 2035, young people won't even understand how the world was once dominated by a single currency that countries were forced to use. But here's where it gets really interesting. BRICS isn't trying to replace the dollar with a single BRICS currency that dominates the world the way the petrodollar dominated. That would just recreate the same power imbalance with different players. Instead, BRICS is building a multipolar currency system where multiple currencies exist together, backed by different commodity baskets, offering different advantages. This actually makes global trade more stable long-term because no single nation can hold the world hostage through currency manipulation. It's more democratic, it's more stable, it's also more competitive, which means nations have to actually perform economically instead of relying on currency dominance to survive. This is why smart investors and economists see the BRICS alternative not as a threat to global stability, but as an improvement. Yes, it reduces American dominance, but it also reduces the instability created when a single currency backs everything. The petrodollar system is dying because the conditions that created it no longer exist. America is no longer 50% of global GDP. America no longer controls the world's oil supply. America's military is stretched too thin to enforce currency dominance through force. And alternatives now exist that are more efficient for the majority of the world's nations. BRICS isn't destroying the petrodollar. BRICS is offering something better, and the world is choosing it voluntarily. By 2027, that choice becomes irreversible. By 2030, the petrodollar is a historical artifact, not current system. And what replaces it is actually more stable, more democratic, and more sustainable than a system where a single nation prints the world's money. That's the real truth about the petrodollar's slow death. It's not a crisis. It's the inevitable result of economic gravity. America ruled because it had to. Now the world doesn't need a single ruler. And that changes everything about how global economics works going forward.